Hello and welcome to Paranormal Friday. I'm your host for this evening, Mary Hawk, and I'm excited to bring you the first episode of Paranormal Friday. We are going to be exploring the unexplained, the unknown, and the little bit spooky. So, thank you so much for joining us for our first episode. And our guest tonight is Josh Chairs, a paranormal detectives. So, I'm going to bring Josh into the studio with us now. Hey, Josh, thank you so much for joining us. Just a second. Okay, let
Hi,
go.
everyone. This is Joshua from Fan of Detectives. I look forward to introducing, obviously, myself to your audience, Mary, and as well as answering any questions from your end and from your listeners' end.
Okay, well, can we start with how did you get interested in doing paranormal investigations?
Sure. I would say back for me, getting back into paranormal investigations goes all the way back to when I was a child in 1988, 87. Obviously, there was two shows that really fascinated my interest in the supernatural. It was the first one, of course, Unsolved Mysteries with the late Robert Stack. That was kind of one of the first true shows out there. And then In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock on Star Trek. He also had a show. I watched a lot of those reruns on television as a 3 or 4 year old child in 1987, 88. And then what really piqued my interest was this episode on Unsolved Mysteries called The Haunting of the General Wayne Inn. It was season one, episode five from 1988. And the General Wayne Inn is a well-known English coaching inn that dates back to 1704. It was originally called Steeper's Tavern and the Wayside Inn, and then in 1792, it was named after Revolutionary War hero Major General Anthony Wayne, who was obviously one of Washington's assistant generals in the American Revolution. And the General Wayne Inn obviously had a lot of famous dignitaries from George Washington, Marquis de Lafayette, Edgar Allan Poe, as well as Ben Franklin's sordid mail there. So a lot of famous people. It was a common stagecoaching for people to basically, as they would stop by there, to basically sleep for the night and on their way to Philadelphia. And this episode covered the paranormal activity associated with the inn, and it was called "The Inn of the 17 Ghosts." And many people report, obviously, the episode covered a lot of where women would basically be sitting at a bar area and they would have their necks blown on, and they thought that was their husbands doing it. Like, hey, did you do that? And obviously, the barkeeper would obviously laugh and see all these women having their necks blown on, like right down the line in the bar. And then, of course, there was supposedly a tenant that supposedly had a tenant had basically went out to go to turn a car off, and the car was completely turned off by itself, no key. There was also obviously the headlights were on, it was completely locked, and there's supposedly the car was on by itself. There was also people seeing Hessian soldiers as well from the American Revolution in different parts of the inn, as well as also a British officer, supposing from the American Revolution. I was looking for a locket of his wife. Both, Hessians were known to occupy that area in 1776 and 1777 under Colonel Raw, when George Washington, of course, was crossing the Delaware, attacking the Hessians at their camp on Christmas night of 1776. So obviously, this was supposedly there was a one Hessian soldier that was left behind and was stuck and died in the tunnels that supposedly led around the tunnels that led to Colonel Raw's regiment in New Jersey. So obviously, this specter has been seen for over 150 years in the end. So that really gauged my interest watching it. And then in the
Right.
90s, I started out, really researching UFOs. And I remember when I was a kid at recess, I was obviously looking up at the sky and always would see different kinds of triangular lights, trying to figure out, like, is there, like, extraterrestrial visitors and stuff like that. And then, of course, I started reading every book by Whitley Strieber, who was a well-known UFO abductee, as well as Dr. Hans Holzer, who was pretty much America's first ghost hunter. In fact, it was his books that inspired the famous movie Ghostbusters, as we know, with Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis,
I
obviously
love that movie.
Bill Murray. I mean, that Ernie Hudson. I mean, everyone. So obviously, those accounts by Dr. Holzer were pretty much the model for what Ghostbusters, what inspired Dan Aykroyd to write the both Ghostbusters script around 82, 83 before it came out in 84. So obviously, of course, and then listening in the 90s, I remember listening to this really fascinating voice that saying this is Dreamland with Art Bell. So obviously, Art Bell. Obviously, I was really engaged in the show, like just switching the AM dial one night, and this voice captivated me, and I started becoming a listener to Coast in the '90s, listening to every single episode of Coast to Coast with Art Bell and Dreamland, the weekend show, which was less color driven. Listen to his
Hmm.
interviews with like John Lear and Malachi Martin. Obviously, talking about Area 51 and talking about like, different ghosts and Madman Markham talking about time travel, which was always fascinating. So those old episodes kind of really shaped me, obviously, as a kid. So as I grew up later on in 2002, I actually had the opportunity to investigate them. General Wayne in with my late mentor, Michael A. Mayer. She passed away in 2010, 2009. But before she passed away and the inn was converted to a Jewish synagogue, I went down to the basement area in the inn. And obviously, back then, paranormal investigating equipment wasn't sophisticated as it is today. Back then, you might have
Right.
had a back then you might have had an EMF meter, maybe a voice recorder, maybe dowsing rods that cross like this, and maybe a digital camera. If that might have been or a Polaroid camera. So you might have very limited technology in the early 2000s. So in the basement area, I remember where people report seeing this apparition of this Hessian soldier. I remember taking three consecutive photos, like just the old, 3-click rule with, obviously old school paranormal investigating. And one of the photos that I captured, there was a green and yellow streaks of light. And I tried to debunk it and try to figure out, like, what light source was hitting this. And I took it to different film companies from Kodak and stuff like that, just trying to take it to different film experts, and they said they have no reasonable explanation why these streaks of light were there. And then obviously, it was my first true paranormal investigation, and with a local team in Philadelphia at that time. And then, of course, in the end, there was also supposedly a murder in 1996. Like one of the business owners killed one of the other owners, and that was really wild. So there's a lot of paranormal activity in this old coaching inn. It's one of Philadelphia's most notorious haunted places. And then around 2004, ghost hunters started coming out on TV. The plumbers from Rotor Rooter, they were
Right.
kind of Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson, who were longtime friends of mine. I've known them for many years, and obviously they started coming out on Sci-Fi. So all these shows started popping up on television. Of course, Ghost Hunters was the first, and then in 2007, Paranormal State came out on A&E, which obviously I have a lot of ties to that show. My best friend Gwen Fellman went to college with Heather Taddy and Katrina Weidman from PRS. Obviously, I got obviously directly involved with them, and I know them personally. Heather and Katrina are longtime friends of mine. And then, obviously when Paranormal State came out, I know Sergi's wife Melissa. She's great. And also in 2008, Ghost Adventures came out. So that was another great show with Zach Baggins and Aaron Goodwin and also Nick Groff, who were pretty much investigating haunted locations. And I love how these shows, I think it was just an explosion coming out on television because I love how they would go through an investigation, set up all their equipment, using the scientific method, which is create a hypothesis, develop the hypothesis, and then test it and see if you have results. So it's really cool to see how the investigation process goes from breaking down the equipment to setting it up, as well as interviewing the clients, the claims of activity, trying to debunk, anything that's in the area. Like, for example, you have a leaky faucet that turns on by itself. And that's how I loved how Jason and Grant were as plumbers, as plumbers during the day, they could see where, hey, there's this leaky faucet, have this valve that might need to be turned on, or there might be a leak or, some kind of break in the pipe that's causing that hallucination of that, paranormal activity. So I loved how these shows would interview the clients and then reveal the evidence at the end of the day. So that was always really cool. And then in 2013, I really started getting more and more interested in it, and I really wanted to start like thinking about, eventually forming my own team. So in 2014, there was this episode called "The Haunting of Summerwind." Summerwind is a location in northern Wisconsin. It's obviously it was originally founded as West Bay Lake Fishing Lodge in 1914 by a guy named John Frank from Akron, Ohio. And Mr. Frank, of course, obviously was a traveling merchant, and he also did a lot of carpentry work. So he eventually ended up moving up to the northern UP of Wisconsin around 1914, 1915, and he built something called West Bay Lake Fishing Lodge. You could stay there for $4.99 a night. And then after he founded West Bay Lake Fishing Lodge, he 2 years later he sold it to a future U.S. Secretary of Commerce by the name of President. Obviously, his name was Robert Patterson Lamont. Mr. Lamont was a bigwig in Washington. And then, so obviously, he took the West Bay Lake Fishing Lodge and converted it to a mansion and called it Lilac Hills. And of course, for all the lilac trees that were on the property nearby. And then, of course, the servants told Mr. Lamont, "Hey, your house is haunted." And he's like, "Grow up. There's no such thing as ghosts." Until he had his own paranormal
Uh-huh.
experience. And this episode was on The Haunting, season one, episode 6, I think. And in that episode, obviously supposedly Mr. Lamont was what he was having sitting at the table with his wife, and he supposedly fired this gun, bang bang, missing this ghost, shooting this gun at the door, and this basement door flew open, revealing this ghostly form of a man. So he fired 2 shots and never returned to this mansion. So around 1948, Mr. Lamont passed away, and the property went to a lady named Lillian Kiefer. In the episode, her name's Miss Murray, so they changed the name in the episode, I guess, to protect identities of the people that were involved in the story. So obviously,
Right.
Miss Kiefer, obviously, bought the place, and for the next 20 years, she would lease it out to people, and we go back to her, lease it out. And it wasn't until the Hinshaw family moved in 1969, 1970, that things really started escalating. So obviously, Ginger Hinshaw, of course, was this lady who had 3 kids. Obviously, her daughter April, of course, who is still alive, and obviously her husband Arnold also had 3 kids. It was kind of like the Brady Bunch family. Each parent had 3 kids, and they kind of came together. So obviously, they saw this place on West Bay Lake. Up in northern UP, Wisconsin, said, "Hey, we got to go ahead and make a go of this place." So they went ahead, called Miss Kiefer, and made a plan to eventually purchase it. So obviously, they got the deed to Summer Wind in 1969, 1970. And remember, they originally sell the place. They thought it was dingy. There was no paint, but it had great potential as a fixer upper, a restoration project. But then they kind of started seeing that there was odd things going on in the mansion. Obviously, supposedly these windows would fly open on their own, so they had to nail them shut. There would also be supposedly, there would be floating voices, dark shadows heard. There were supposedly full body apparitions and a floating lady that was seen in the kitchen, in a white dress. Supposedly people have seen her apparition there. And what happened was, and supposedly Mr. Hinshaw, there's a story in the book, The Carver Effect, a paranormal experience that was written by obviously April's grandfather, and of course Ginger's father, Wolfgang von Bober, that covers all the paranormal experiences. You can still find it on Amazon, but it's very expensive. It's like $300 to $500. But you can find most of the stuff is covered in the book from this haunting episode. So as time went on, supposedly Mr. Henshaw's car caught on fire. He was a construction worker, and then supposedly, here's a story from Summerwind that will gore your hair. Later on, several weeks later, supposedly she obviously Mr. Henshaw had saw this crawl space, so he would ask his 10-year-old daughter to crawl in it. And in this crawl space, supposedly April crawled in. She was about 10 years old at that time. Supposedly she saw this skeleton with black hair, and obviously she completely screamed, terrified, and told her stepdad what she had seen. So obviously they went and they called the local Land Lakes police, and supposedly the police came, and the next day, and the skeleton was gone. And this is where the story of Summerwind really gets crazy, because supposedly, according to the book, Mr. Hinshaw, the stepfather who was living on the property, was actually supposedly, like, he went mad. He started playing this organ. There's this huge Wurlitzer organ inside the house, and he started playing the organ to all hours of the night, and claiming that the ghosts were claiming him to call it. So the family was completely terrified. that Mr. Hinshaw supposedly started going mad, and they resorted to staying in one room in the mansion. So obviously, what happened was supposedly the story in the book that Ginger tried committing suicide, and then obviously Mr. Hinshaw was committed to a mental institution and was never seen again. And so basically, Ginger completely had a mental breakdown and she left, but she did survive. Mr. Hinshaw was never seen from again. So obviously, the property went back to Miss Kiefer, and then when Miss Kiefer got it, obviously, Ginger's father, Raymond von Bober Sr., he was a popcorn vendor from Chicago. He thought he could make a go of the place again. He said, "Hey, I like this place. Maybe I can do something with it, and do something with it that where Ginger couldn't." So obviously, he hired contractors, and obviously they would have similar problems that the Hinshaws ran into. They would have construction workers come to work on the property, and tools would disappear. And according to the Summerwind story,
That could get
it
expensive.
that yes, it can. And obviously, with the renovations they were trying to do, supposedly they would measure the rooms basically from the original blueprints, and supposedly, according to the story, the rooms would change shape. This was reported in the book, obviously the Carver effect, and obviously, so they would be doing the different rooms, measuring the rooms from the original blueprints, and there supposedly there was also uh, Ray Jr. basically, who was Raymond von Bober's son and Ginger's brother. He of course was in the army at the time, and obviously he was working on the property. So the Bobers never lived in Summerwind; they had a trailer outside the house. So they would be working, and supposedly when Ray Jr. was working one day, he basically started hearing gunshots. So he went downstairs and saw the bullet holes where Mr. Lamont fired that gun, many years later. And obviously he left terrified. And so obviously they're trying to make a bed and breakfast out of the place, but supposedly the Bobers gave it back to Miss Kiefer around 79, 78. And then, obviously Miss Kiefer obviously went ahead. She passed away in 85. So after she passed away, there was another couple up in La Crosse, Wisconsin by the name of Harold and Babs Tracy. They're still alive and they're in their late 70s, early 80s now. But obviously they both decided to buy the place, and they thought, hey, why don't we, maybe we can make a go of it. So after buying it, Mr. Tracy bought the property as a wedding anniversary present to Miss Tracy. So obviously after they purchased it, according to one night, obviously they supposedly walked up to the mansion, and obviously when they walked up, they started reporting that the mansion was inhaling, like taking a life of its own. And then obviously, fortunately, 2 years later, on Father's Day of 1988, Summerwind, lightning and fire took it down, and it was burnt down. So obviously, the servant's house that was on the property, the playhouse, the obviously all the buildings on the property just completely leveled down by fire. And what's interesting was all that remains today of the Summerwind now are the ruins. You can still go to the Summerwind ruins today, but all you'll see is the foundation, the steps, and the chimneys. So obviously it's completely gone. But obviously, what's interesting was my friend Craig Nearing, who actually is friends with the Tracys. He runs an organization up in the northern UP, Wisconsin called Fox Valley Ghost Hunters. And Fox Valley Ghost Hunters are friends of fan detectives. And supposedly, Craig told me there was this neighbor that lived next door to Summerwind, and this made the Milwaukee Sentinel in November 2017, where basically this neighbor told Craig that obviously the township itself was tired of people trespassing on the property to get their own paranormal experience and vandalizing the property. So supposedly the township took it upon itself to burn the property down. They supposedly took bales of hay, and there was a fire marshal that told this neighbor that there'd be obviously a fire, the fire department would be on site and it'd be a controlled burn. So obviously for the township to cover this up and then burn their Tracy's property, I think was completely wrong. So obviously, there's nothing left now. But here's where I come in. 2014, I go ahead and saw that summerwindmansion.com was still standing. There was a website that gave you all this information on Summerwind because I was really interested on the property after seeing the actual oh yeah, the website and the history of Summerwind. So I looked it up and I saw blueprints for sale, and I emailed the seller, and it turned out to be Raymond von Bober Jr. So Ray Jr. of course is the brother of Ginger, and obviously I bought the original blueprints to Summerwind. They're known as Wisconsin's most notorious haunted house. And what's amazing is Summerwind, obviously, in 1980, the November 1980 issue with Walter Cronkite, it's mentioned as the most haunted mansion in the Midwest. Obviously, so based on the book, The Carver Effect. So obviously, I bought the property, and then I seeked out a connection to the Tracys. and I came across Craig Nearing from Fox Valley Ghost Hunters. He's like, "Hey, I have, call me if you have the blueprints." And we started talking. I sent him a copy of the blueprints, and we created the Summerwind Restoration Society in 2014, obviously where we decided to work on restoring and rebuilding and relaunching Summerwind as a haunted bed and breakfast, and we're trying to work with the current owners to rebuild this haunted house from the ground up. Obviously something never done before in the paranormal, because obviously now we rebuild exactly as it was prior to the fire in 1988. The only problem is coming up with funding. It's going to cost between $500,000 to $700,000 based on building codes and zoning and all that stuff, and you have to have obviously certain ordinances, and of course there's a lot involved in it. But I think if this place is rebuilt, it could have great potential as, like, a haunted, you maybe have a haunted museum out of it, or you can run it as a bed and breakfast. So there's great potential in this project.
There certainly is, Josh. And I want to pause for a minute and say hello to Mary and Reverend Don and Jade and Ramona in the chat room. Thank you all for joining us. And do keep us posted on the bed and breakfast project.
Yes, absolutely. And what's really cool about this, I think, especially there's a group on Facebook. I know Craig. I passed that project on to Craig, that you can join, like, to see where the project's at. Because I know Craig is kind of spearheading the rebuilding project of Summerwind. There's a website. I think it's on our Facebook. You can just look up a group called Summerwind Haunted Mansion. Obviously, all one word. So Summerwind space Haunted space Mansion. And I know Craig is and my friend Michelle. And what's interesting in the book, there's supposedly the Carver Effect book. Supposedly, there's this claim that there's this English explorer by the name of Jonathan Carver that was haunting the property, and obviously that's where the name Carver and the Carver Effect comes out. And it's funny because one of the Carver descendants is actually working with Craig on the project, which is really cool to have one of his many times great granddaughters in the
That
project.
is.
That's really neat. So imagine if you could take this old house and Ghost Adventures and kind of roll into one. That's where I could see this project going in the future. So I know Bellinger from Ghost Adventures has been in touch with Craig. So maybe in the future we'll get a future rebuilding series. I could see an entire TV series come out of this. It could be really, really cool.
You could. I absolutely see that. Now, you've mentioned several times the equipment you use and the changes in equipment. So, could you speak to that for a little bit?
Sure. So there's a lot of different sophistications of paranormal investigation equipment. So obviously back 30, 40 years ago or 20 years ago, you might have had the real basic stuff, which is your voice recorders, your EMF meters, which measure electromagnetic fields in milligauss, dowsing rods, which you could pretty much make out of coat hangers. Those were real basic. Maybe a Geiger counter that measures
Can you
radiation.
explain what an EMF meter does? We've all seen the shows and we've seen Ghostbusters where they walk around with the thing that comes up and beeps. But what is that measuring, and does that tell us how does that tell us paranormal activity is
Sure.
present?
So an EMF meter measures something called electromagnetic fields. These are fields that are unseen to the human eye. Obviously, these we all have electromagnetic fields just from we have energy basically. So the law of energy states that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but move from one form to another. So obviously, spirits obviously probably have to use electromagnetic energy to show and manifest themselves. So obviously, a lot of times the EMF meters are you have to be very careful when you use them around electrical appliances like microwaves. Obviously, anything,
I was
electrical
going to ask you that.
yeah,
Could
insulation.
will it pick up a microwave?
Yeah, yeah. So you got that's all false positives. So your K2 meters have that as well as your other obviously apparatuses. So it's very important that you obviously have make sure that you're not near anything electrical. Also, the best thing also to do something called EVPs. There's something you can just buy your digital voice recorders. Now, back in the old days of paranormal investigating, like during the Hans Holzer days, a lot of them use like old tape recorder. That's how they got a lot of recorded the electronic voice phenomena in the '90s and the '80s when and during paranormal investigating. And now, of course, you can buy digital recorders, which obviously are even better because obviously you can store on way more space than you could a cassette tape. And the advantage of that is you can also go into a free audio program like Audacity and like clean up the audio and sometimes pick up voices like you're never going to get like a full sentence or a full you're going to pick up you might pick up like fragments of words. We've caught in so many EVPs just by we have something called phantom time where we let the phantoms talk to us in our voice recorders. So obviously voice recorders have been pretty much a part of paranormal investigation since the beginning. And of course the dowsing rods. What's really cool is that the difference in the technology is there's these new ones from North Canton Paranormal Detectives. When you hold them, they actually light up in the dark. They really work fantastic in the dark. And obviously, our team member Rick Warner, who's not here tonight, but obviously he's an expert at the dowsing rods. Obviously, these look really great. You can change the colors on the fly. And obviously, you can change it from red, the green, the blue. And I'll provide your listeners a link to order these dowsing rods if they'd like to get their own, copy of these dowsing rods. They work fantastic, and they're
Now I find this fascinating because I have used dowsing rods made from the metal coat hangers seated in the bodies of a cheap ink pen. You take the ink cartridge out, seat them in so you're not holding it yourself. Then you ask it a question, and in general, it goes wide open for yes, it crosses for no, and it kind of quivers and maybe goes straight if it can't answer.
right.
So what response do you get if do you ask it if a
Yeah.
spirit's present?
I,
How does it work?
Sure. Usually, Rick is really good at these. So usually, what you do is you're going to hold them kind of like this, steady, and usually you'll say, "If there's any spirits here with me, obviously, please cross the rods for yes or no." And so basically, if they'll make an X for yes, and they'll pull apart the words for no. So obviously, if you hold them level and they go this way towards your shoulders, that's a no. If they cross it for yes, for X, if they make like an X, it's a yes. So that's the kind of general
Okay.
theory
Now,
behind the.
Josh, I just witnessed fireworks around your picture. Did you do that?
No, I did not.
When you were explaining, okay, in the chat, did anyone else see the fireworks around Josh? Yes or no? Somebody answer me because I witnessed fireworks go off around Josh's head here. And I'm going to wind up running the recording back.
Wow, that's crazy.
Anybody else see it? Tell me yes, tell me no's. Come on, somebody say something in the chat. You can say you're crazy, Mary. I don't care. I know most of you anyway. But you did not do something to create a video effect.
Nope. I'm actually like within literally probably like 3 to 5 feet away from my cell phone, so there was no way that I could have done anything. So that was truly
Okay.
truly
And
paranormal itself.
nobody is putting anything in the chat, but I do see that we have active viewers.
That's awesome.
So
Very cool.
yes, I witness, and I have been working with Restream doing live streams for several years now
Wow.
with guests on various shows, and I have never seen this happen before.
Wow, that's interesting. So obviously, for that to happen the way it did is completely paranormal itself. It defies what science explains. Like that's exactly what the paranormal is. It's
Yeah,
obviously.
and I'm just sitting here thinking, okay, for the record, folks, I live in a brand new house. We moved in at the end of August 2023.
And so for that to happen, I have no reasonable explanation, like other than maybe some kind of technical glitch somehow in the software. That's the only possible
A
thing. What?
technical glitch that made fireworks go off surrounding your face, basically.
That's
It was like a visual effect.
that's wow. That's amazing. And obviously, I've never seen
And
that.
nobody else is going to respond. I'd be happy for someone to say, "No, Mary, I didn't see it."
Wow. Obviously, this is going to be great. We go back to play this and see exactly what happened. We could try to figure out like the cause and effect.
Yeah, it was fireworks. I have never ever seen that happen. As far as I know, there is no way to introduce visual effects like that in
Nope.
Restream.
Not that I know of. Obviously, like I know other
I could
programs,
do
but
it I can record in Restream, edit, and then play the video afterwards, but we are streaming live. So, on our first edition of Paranormal Friday, I witnessed something paranormal, even if nobody else has, and you did not see it on your playback.
no, I did not.
All right. Thank you for whoever decided to mess with Mary tonight. Well played.
All right. So I think we were talking about the equipment. So obviously the technology.
Yes.
So let's go continue that discussion. So obviously there was also early version. I actually have this at home. I don't usually bring it out, but I actually have an original Frank's box. So the Frank's box, of course, was the original prototype developed by a guy named Frank. And basically, the original thing it's called this original spirit box. This kind of helped. This helped. This was the early version of the original Ghost box. I'm sure you've all you seen, all you listeners out there have seen the PSB sevens, the PSB 11s, the S box. You know, the spirit boxes that scan the AM and FM stations, kind of like a Hack-a-Shack radio box from Radio Shack, where you can scan the AM FM airways front, forward, and backward, and sometimes pick up spirit voices on those devices. And what's really cool is the PSB7, PSB11 was developed by a well-known paranormal investigator by the name of Gary Galka. Obviously, he did them as a tribute to his daughter Melissa, who passed away in 2004. Obviously, she was coming home from homecoming and she was hit a tree and was killed on impact. But obviously,
Oh no.
Gary started getting signs of Melissa's presence in his home. Obviously, many years later, and he developed the PSB7 and the Mel meter based on Mel being obviously her name of his daughter, and 87 when she was born, in 2004 when she passed away. So obviously, Melissa is very prevalent, and Gary Kalka's got a really cool YouTube channel where you can see obviously signs of Melissa's presence even after she passed away. So they did an entire episode on that on Ghost Adventures, which is very touching, to me. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, so that was amazing. And I would like to talk a little bit about Art Bell. So, 2015, I started basically, wanting to book my friends Craig Naring and Kevin Malik because I was working on the Summer Wind project at that time, and I started phoning in to one of Art's former producers who was out in California, and I said, "Hey, would you be interested in?" Obviously, booking my friends Craig Naring and the late Kevin Malik, and of course, Kevin was the supporting society of the Summer Wind project. He ran a group called Northern Wisconsin Paranormal Society. He passed away in 2019, but before he passed away, I booked him on a show called Dr. J Radio Live, and of course, Dr. J was one of Art Bell's associate producers, and he's obviously I'll try to book him on as a screening on Midnight in the Desert, which was Art's final return. So obviously, Art, of course, was a well-known radio show host out of Pahrump, Nevada. Obviously, he was born the 19th June 18th, 1945, and passed away on April 13th, 2018. But he was really one of the first true paranormal radio hosts. And he actually, in 1959, he became a certified radio operator as obviously a kid, and obviously was always interested in, like, being able to use, like, call different people, different all parts of the world. So, using radio signals and stuff like that. So Art was really involved in radio in an early career. He was also a medic in the army, basically, which was pretty amazing. And of course, back he had a in the 1960s, he married someone named Sachiko Pontius, and I know Art Bell's first son, Vincent. He lives right near me. Vincent Pontius, his name is Vincent Manet, and he's Art's first son. And obviously, during that time, Art was actually on a English-speaking radio station out in Okinawa, where he literally broadcasted for 115 consecutive hours, which is still a Guinness World Record book holder for endurance broadcasting. That's still a record by any of his single major radio shows. So he obviously set the standard for radio broadcasting. And then, of course, in the 1970s, the late 1978, he founded a program called West Coast AM, which, of course, would be the predecessor to Coast AM. Obviously, they changed the name around 88 because Art was doing political talk radio at that time, but listeners were kind of getting bored. So he decided, I'm going to go ahead and start changing it to paranormal. So around 1990, 1991, 92, his first interview was with a CIA contract pilot by the name of John Lear. And of course, Mr. Lear was the son of the Lear jet founder. I think it's Fred Lear. And of course, of course, Mr. Lear talked about he had like 30,000 hours of flight instruction, field instructor, ground instructor, and talked about seeing UFOs. So that's where he started evolving his radio program. Then, of course, more and more radio stations started, picking up more Art show, and eventually exploded in the 90s. I believe at one point Art was literally had 15 to 20 million listeners a night, which was absolutely amazing at that time. Obviously, his show was pretty much on every single radio station throughout America. And obviously, it was amazing because he would let people call into a show. And which was amazing was he would take unscreened calls in the middle of the night. Like nobody had ever done that before, where he would take cold calls, set up in the night basically. And he would do all this inside of his own home, basically, because he was in Pahrump, Nevada. So obviously he was in the desert area, so he'd be able to reach millions of listeners. He had satellite stuff like that, SDS feeds. But obviously he was just amazing at what he did, and for him to be able to reach that many people. And then he created the first true. He would actually also every Halloween he would read ghost stories live over the air, which was also amazing. He would obviously read these, like people would fax in their ghost stories to Art back in the 90s, and he would read ghost stories in different parts of the country. They would just fax in their ghost stories, and he would call that Ghost to Ghost AM. So basically what happened was several years later he would be on Coast to Coast and retire again. In 2010 he sold his radio station to a lady named Karen Jackson of KNYE. And of course, Karen was his neighbor who bought it from him. She used to do radio advertisement on Art's station. So Art pretty much founded Radio in Pahrump. Obviously, this station is still around today, and Karen still runs it. And then, of course, he married his fourth wife, Erin, after his third wife, Ramona. Of course, Ramona was his true love. Obviously, they were together for like 16 years before she passed away in 2006. So he went back to the Philippines, and then, of course, met Erin, and of course, they got married. And obviously, when Art, his second final return, he had a program called Dark Matter, which was kind of like a spinoff of Coast to Coast AM. But the problem was he was only did a 6 or 7 week run on Sirius XM because they wanted, obviously, supposedly Sirius would want him to pay literally, I think have his subscribers and his listeners pay $200 a year for to be able to stream our show. And Art's like, hold on, I'm not going to do this. So obviously he went back to his webmaster, a guy named Keith Rowland, who Keith, of course, was his longtime webmaster and technical guru, to create a free streaming network. So obviously, in late 2014, 2015, he created a radio program called a network called Dark Matter Digital Network. So obviously, the whole idea was the way that people would pay for this would be a subscription system for like $4.99 a night, where you can basically listen to Midnight in the Desert. So obviously, Art decided, okay, now I have a network where I can stream from. I need a name for the show. So basically, there was a forum basically where they said, hey, why don't we put this up to a vote? So he went to artbell.com and did a little survey, and obviously said, what would you like to name the show? And some people say, hey, why don't you just call it the Art Bell Show? People will tune in and call in. But some of the other people say, hey, why don't you call it Midnight in the Desert? So Midnight in the Desert was a song that Crystal Gale, a famous musician, wrote for Art. And that name basically turned out to be hands down the best name. So he took it and he rolled with it. So obviously he called the program Midnight in the Desert, and he came back for the final time in July 20th of 2015, and then all the way till December 2015 until he obviously gave the show to another person, and that lady, she hosted it for 2.5 years. And then, of course, the Midnight in the Desert went through several hosts from Dave Schrader, of course, of Darkness Radio, to other hosts. But unfortunately, the company closed in 2020. So obviously, Art has passed away, but everybody misses him. He was probably the first true paranormal radio host. He really helped pioneer AM and FM. So we actually did something special, and I'd love to like tie in now how I worked with them. So I ended up working with the staff members. I booked all their guests, set up all the contacts. I was kind of like the producer behind the scenes, making the connections, setting up the shows, doing the sound checks, writing the questions for his staff members. So that was a great respect. So obviously in 2020, I wanted to go ahead and say, you know what? I want to start revolutionizing paranormal investigating. I want to start building my own team. So my whole inspiration for creating Phantom Detectives was obviously I saw this really cool comic. There was a comic in the 1930s and through 50s called the Phantom Detective. So I said, you know what? This could be a really cool name for a paranormal team. And I said, why don't we go ahead and build this from the ground up? So I created business cards. I obviously had set up all the social media pages. I started inviting people to the pages. I also started set up a YouTube channel, and then just kind of, and I had a logo design, our first early 2020 logo. And then after I started building the obviously company from the ground up, I also had a website program from a company in India, and they went ahead and created the website. And then of course I started inviting people to join my new organization. And then I started my first team member I brought over from a previous team, and she was a Civil War reenactor, a sound engineer. She also, knew how to create her own paranormal equipment. So she was really good to have in the early days of building out the organization. And what's great was in 2020, of course, mind you, there obviously wasn't a lot of teams. A lot of teams had gone by the wayside and didn't work out. So I was trying to, do something new and bring a fresh idea to the approach of investigating. So of course, after inviting my former team member, I went to a place called the Selma Mansion, which is in Norristown. And the Selma Mansion, of course, I had the opportunity to train that night under a guy named Brian J. Cano. Of course, Mr. Cano is the tech manager. He was on the show with John Zaffis called The Haunted Collector. So Brian, of course, gave us the knowledge on how to use EMF meters, how to use the SLS camera, how to take digital camera pictures, thermal pictures, use the pendulum. So obviously we took all this knowledge and we booked our first investigation at a place called the Sanderson Museum in December 2020. And the Sanderson Museum was kind of like our training hall in the early days. So the Sanderson Museum, of course, is amazing. It's in Chadsford. It's very historic. Miss Christian Sanderson was a poet. He was a musician. He's hosted a lot of square dances in the area. He was very well known. And inside the museum, you can still see a lot of artifacts. And obviously, there's even like a purse from the Jenny Wade House in Gettysburg. There's also a bandage that was on President Abraham Lincoln after he was shot by John Wilkes Booth in obviously 1865. There's also like famous letters from famous dignitaries like Helen Keller, Sitting Bull, Shirley Temple in the museum. So obviously, Mr. Sanderson knew a lot of people, and this museum is amazing. Obviously, and what's amazing is we did our first investigation. So obviously, we set up equipment in the violin room, which is upstairs, where Mr. Sanderson had his violin and his personal collection of obviously his chairs up there. And what's interesting was we set up a DVR camera, and of course, security camera. Um, Obviously just a standard Zuzi, you buy your home security systems, and we set up that and put a camera in there. And what's interesting was we picked up this huge orb. It was multicolored. Obviously, it's multicolored orb. It wasn't a dust particle. It wasn't how you could definitely see some kind of facial features. And it was interesting was at the same time picking up this orb, we also, our EMF meters, our batteries drained. So a lot of times spirits will drain the batteries out of equipment, kind of showing that. So obviously the security camera was going off. Nobody was in the room. The EMF meter, the batteries drained. At the same time, obviously we started picking up like, obviously this strange we took a thermal picture and you could see like some kind of apparition kind of standing there in the corner near the chair. So that was pretty amazing. And of course we got an EVP there too. So the Sanderson Museum was definitely a great way to launch Phantom Detectives. And then after that investigation, we went ahead and we had our third team member join, who is Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, psychic explorer. He's world renowned. He's amazing. Mark, of course, has been on Gaia TV, Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. He's also an Oxford educated attorney. Obviously, he's got a new book called The Afterlife Frequency. So obviously, Mark
Mhm.
is also amazing. He's like one of the top mediums in the world. He joined us as a researcher, and then we booked our second investigation at a place called the Mill of Anselma. The Mill of Anselma is really cool. It's up in Chester Springs, Pennsylvania. It is obviously outside Downingtown. Really cool place. It's this old feed mill, and supposedly it dates back to 1747. It's called the Lightfoot Mill, and we booked our second investigation in January 2021. And that night we had a lot of crazy things happen. Me and my former team member were the only ones there that night, and you could see this. We set up a security camera near the door entrance of the mill. You could see this thing. This door is completely latched shut, bolted shut, and obviously it flies open by itself. I mean, literally, I try to debunk it, and it's one of our best pieces of evidence in Fan Detectives is that this door, it has an old 18th century life. You have to physically lift up this latch and then pull the door this way for it to open up, and you can see this door fly open from the mill on its own, and it's basically under YouTube under our shorts, and that was a really amazing piece of evidence. We also picked up several
So
thermal
can you
images.
see the latch lift?
Yep. Yes, it can. Yes. Yep. And that's pretty amazing. And obviously, this latch completely lifted up by itself, bolted shut, flying open. And we also called it EVP up on the third floor. I was by myself, just using my voice recorder, and just like went back and I said, "Is there anybody here? Would you like to communicate with me?" And I got this word "go, go," like this male voice. I said "go," and there was nobody up there that night. So that was an amazing EVP capture from our second investigation. And then,
Okay, I have to ask you, a male voice told you to go. Did
yes,
you stay or did you go?
I stayed because obviously I wanted to be able to continue on that night because I was determined to capture more evidence. Like, I'm not going to let a spirit, like, and of course, the nice thing is with your kind of respect, we're always like, say, thank you and please allowing us for coming in your home or your business. Thank you for the opportunity. So we always like show like gratitude to the spirits when they show themselves to us, and we show respect. And when you treat the spirits with respect and kindness, you're going to get a lot of obviously a lot of they'll reveal themselves to you. They might reveal themselves through images or voices. So obviously respect for the spirit and treat them as like it's their home, basically. When you do that, you're going to get great examples. Don't do the old Zach Baggins, if you did it to him, they'll do it to me. That's kind of like provoking, and we never encourage anybody in paranormal investigating to ever provoke spirits, because that's not the right approach. The right approach is to say please and thank you, and you'll get great response every time. And what was wild was, after we had that investigation, I got an email from Historic Philadelphia and said, "Hey, could you be interested in coming to the Betsy Ross house?" And I said, "Absolutely." The Betsy Ross house, of course, is one of the most haunted places. And then I connected with a guy on LinkedIn. His name's Mr. Rick Warner, and Mr. Warner, of course, came from the UFO world. He's from MUFON, so obviously he came in. He had skills in filming investigations, which he's really good on camera filming. He has skills in client interviews, in setting up equipment, and also I brought him into the Fan Detectives talent pool in March 2021. And I said, "Hey, why don't you come with us to the Betsy Ross house?" And we booked this through Historic Philadelphia. And of course, the Betsy Ross house is one of the most amazing places. Obviously, it was Betsy, of course, was that's where the nation's first flag was sewn in 1776. General Washington commissioned Betsy to build this flag, and she sewed it literally within a few weeks. And obviously, the first 13 stars, and the first ever flag was sewn there. And of course, she passed away in the I think around 1785, 86. And of course, many people report seeing Betsy's spirit in different parts of the house. And of course, it became a tavern years later. And inside Betsy Ross' house, our team member Rick Warner, when he made his debut in investigation, he was with my former team member at the time, who was still with the team, and they went down to the basement area. So they did something. They
Mhm.
did an they set up a paralight, which is like one of those little. It's like EMF meter that it's basically like into a lantern. It'll like kind of create some lights all the way from like
Mhm.
yellow to green. That was going off like crazy. At the same time, on this voice recorder, Rick started picking up these growls. and these growls sounded very demonic. They sounded like a pterodactyl screaming, like very terrifying growls. And you can see this on our EVP page. Every investigation, we upload new EVPs on our website, and you can hear these growls from the Betsy Ross house right on our website. It was terrifying, and obviously that was very scary that night. And I will never forget those EVPs that we captured. And I also got another EVP upstairs in the guest room, which was obviously known to be, I think Betsy's one of her. She would have a guest over that would stay there, and that would, I got an EVP. I said, I've been here too. And then, and several months later, we actually had a new team member join. So obviously, I'd love to talk about Melissa Ferrazzano. So obviously, we had Rick, of course, join. Our former team member was there. I decided to add. We didn't have a psychic medium. I wanted to really bring in somebody from the mediumship world to really help us like
Right.
understand why we were having these experiences. So I brought in somebody named Melissa Ferrazzano, and Melissa, of course, she is a pretty amazing medium. She's been studying advanced mediumship, advanced development. She's also an expert in shamanic healing, crystal healing, energy tapping, past life regression. She knows a lot, and she was recommended. I was originally trying to get a world famous medium like to investigate with us called named by Cindy Kaza. She's been on the show The Holzer Files, with Dave Schrader, Shane Pittman, and Cindy. So Cindy, of course, recommended her student Melissa to join us, and I brought Melissa in because I saw that she had great potential as a psychic medium. And then obviously she joined us. And then right around May 2021, Art Bell's affiliate director called me and said, hey, would you be interested in purchasing Dark Matter News? I did a 5-minute paranormal newscast on Midnight in the Desert. So I said, absolutely, let's go ahead and purchase this. So I went ahead and obviously made an offer, and I bought the Dark Matter News name, the Dark Matter News logos, all the audio files, the
Wow.
Leo Ashcraft recorder for Art Bell. And what we did is I tore down, I just leveled the original website because I just didn't want anything to do with the original. And when I built the Dark Matter News name, my whole idea was to kind of bring it back as a tribute site to Art, like his memory, his passion.
Sounds good.
So obviously, I had a new website created, and we launched it in July 2021. And then what was amazing was we went to me and my former team member. We went to an event called Feminology 2021. This was after the pandemic was going on, and I originally came across a guy named the late Bill Freeman. Of course, Bill passed away in 2022, but 10 months before he passed away, I said, hey, can we come back to the Selma Mansion and do a private investigation? Because obviously the first time I went with Brian J. Cano doing a public investigation, but the private was great because he said, absolutely, give me a date and we'll book it. So obviously, after we purchased Dark Matter News, we went into, and Melissa started saying, hey, I'm picking up this was her debut night, Investigation 4. And she's like, I'm picking up a connection to Lincoln. Lincoln, what does Lincoln have to do with the Selma Mansion? I go back and check the history, and I find out that General Andrew Porter was obviously Abraham Lincoln's, or Mary Todd Lincoln's great grandfather. So President Lincoln's wife was connected, was her great grandfather that created the Selma Mansion, General Porter, who was one of Washington's other assistants in the American Revolution. And then obviously I find out, supposing Melissa's like, I'm also picking up on this servant lady named Martha. And I go back and check that, and I asked Bill, is there any lady named Martha? And he said, yes. There was somebody named Martha. There was a servant here, obviously back in the late 1700s, early 1800s for the Porters, that she was there to serve us. So inside the mansion, we had a lot of crazy things happen that night. We set up equipment in various places, and literally, I would set up a REM pod, which is one of those little like beep beep beep, like little like it lights up basically, kind of beeps, and obviously, I think it stands for like radiating electronic microwave or something like that. So obviously, you set up a REM pod and you just kind of put it in the center of this room. It's in this piano room. And literally, I would just, because I was like, that night I got my, COVID-19 vaccine to protect me. So obviously, I was kind of feeling the effects from the vaccine a little bit. So obviously, I was just kind of watching the DVR most of the night. But literally, this REM pod would light up and go beep, and out like as soon as I left the room. But when I would go back to my station, it would stop. If I walk in the room, it would stop. So it's almost like it's like a child spirit, or was trying to play with me. I would walk inside the room. I would leave the room in the DVR system, watch it, and it would go off. And all of a sudden, I walk in the room, it would stop. And then later that night, up in the top third floor, we had a guest investigator. Her name was Ashley that night. She was there with us. Supposedly, her boyfriend at the time supposedly said he saw this tall figure with black hair looking out at the window at him. And I said, "Were any of you guys up there at that time?" We said, "No, we were on the second floor." So that was pretty terrifying. That supposedly one of our guest investigators' boyfriends saw a apparition on the third floor. And then what's interesting, there's this up in the Selma mansion, there's this doll room. So obviously, up in the doll room, we had a lot of crazy things happen. One of our team members had basically it's called the Paranology's electroscope. It picks up static electricity. This thing was going off like crazy. We also had these. Also, I swore I saw like one of these in this child's room. You could see these doors fly open by themselves. Obviously, we didn't investigate the other part of the fourth floor up in the Selma mansion because it was just too terrifying. And then we also had EMF meters spiking nonstop, so that place was crazy. And then later that night, we went into the kitchen area using something called SLS camera. So SLS is something that was developed by a paranormal investigator by the name of Bill Chappell. He was the gear tech on Ghost Adventures. He used an Xbox camera called the Structure Light Sensor. It's your Xbox Kinect cameras that are usually, and what that does, it'll pick up stick figures. It'll pick up anything unseen to the human eye. It'll map it on this camera, and it'll have the word anomaly written on it. It'll draw stick figures. So we started obviously aiming this SLS camera against a solid wall in the kitchen, and you can see pretty much this servant lady, like you can see her apparition moving around at different points. So like I think that was definitely the spirit Martha. And what's interesting was we didn't have this against. There was no chandeliers hanging on the wall, no water bottles. This was just a solid wall. Obviously, we picked up an apparition on. So you got to be very careful with the SLS camera because if you're using it, you just got to make sure that you're not having any kind of water bottles or chandeliers because it can cause a false mapping. But obviously, if you hold the camera steady, you can sometimes get evidence. And we also picked up a thermal image at night too. So the Selma Mansion was definitely a really cool experience.
It sounds like it. And we are coming up on the top of the hour here. I do want to pause for a minute and
Sure,
see if anybody has a question they want to post in chat for you.
sure.
And I want to say, you're reminding me of we had briefly stayed somewhere in the middle of moving, and I knew there was a ghost in the kitchen.
Right,
We would all catch movement out of the corner of our eye.
right.
And of course, I am Wiccan. That's my spiritual background.
Awesome.
So I was offering the ghost a cup of coffee. I always seemed to feel a presence when I was making my coffee in the morning.
Right.
So I offered the ghost a cup of coffee.
Wow, really? Wow. So obviously, you definitely felt that there was something there too. Obviously, you definitely felt
I
that
would catch something out of the corner of my eye, and my husband and my sister both said the same thing. We would all catch something.
Wow. So obviously, you definitely felt that this spirit was very much like trying to let you know, hey, obviously, I'm here. I'm letting you know my presence.
Yeah, we were just staying there temporarily, so I would just put out a cup of coffee and say thank you for your hospitality.
Absolutely. And you know what's funny? I remember watching Katrina and Heather on Paranormal State, and of course, my friend team member Holly False is all part of the team. She worked under Elfie, and obviously, I remember they used to do like a baby powder experiment where they would take baby powder on the show, and obviously, like just let it around like drinks and stuff like that to see if stuff would move. And a lot of times, you can see that you can see fingerprints on the baby powder move, like shift the glass and stuff like that. So there's a lot of really cool different techniques that you can use to get responses from spirits. And obviously, that you mentioned with that drink thing, that's amazing. You actually had that happen to you.
Yeah. So, and I'm not seeing any questions in chat, so I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, no problem.
And I
And I would love to do this again sometime. And obviously, this was a really great experience. I had a lot of fun tonight, and this was going to be a lot
oh,
of.
it was Great having you, and we definitely want to have you back on the show soon.
Definitely.
And thank you to everyone who joined us. This is Paranormal Friday, and we will be back next Friday at 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, and whatever time zone you're in.